Hey everyone, Brandon here from Poindexter. This is the first video in quite a while that I've done documenting our journey here, some of our trials and tribulations, and we've recently just raised a round of funding, and we now have been on the market for 5 years, which is insane. And I figured we have enough experience or validation behind us to get back to doing these videos and past that initial imposter syndrome that I was dealing with earlier on, at least. I don't know if that's something you ever truly get over, but I think that we've learned enough now to at least start getting back into creating videos that convey what we're learning to you so that you can learn alongside us. So today what we're doing is we're talking about the 3 biggest mistakes that I've made so far running Poindexter, and it's hard to choose just 3. There's been a lot, but I think that these are at least in contention for the 3 biggest. So without further ado, the first mistake is not including your potential customers or users in the development of your product or service. And this is something I see all the time. I go to meetups and I talk to entrepreneurs that are doing this. I read blogs about entrepreneurs doing this. I did this. It's a really big mistake because it can set you back years or potentially even do the company in for good. So it's something that is easy to avoid, but nobody does it. And I think that's partly because entrepreneurs tend to be a little more creative. They come up with an idea and then they just want to get to work on it right away, right? Manifest it into reality as quickly as possible without any external input. And this is something I see more so probably earlier entrepreneurs make it. More seasoned entrepreneurs probably don't do this as often, but nonetheless, it is a mistake that is very prevalent, and we did commit. So I think we'd be an unrecognizable company at this point if we had just done this one thing, and we'd be a lot further along. But that's just speculation, but I truly believe that. So the thing about talking to potential customers is that it gives you certain types of information about where you're headed and what you're doing that is really helpful to know earlier on before you've already invested into the direction that you're going. So there's kind of 2 levels of information that you get from this, at least as far as what we're going to cover here. So the first is kind of higher level. So it's a level of whether there's a match or a mismatch between your customer and your potential product or service. And then on the other flip side of that, there's also, you can understand whether there's validation for what you're doing. And you'll be able to know this by making inferences regarding what people are saying and how they're interacting with whatever it is you're creating. So if you're starting to hear things like, I don't get it, or who's it for, there's obviously a disconnect between the value that you're trying to deliver to the potential customer and what that customer perceives as far as the value is concerned. So there could be a lot of reasons that that's the case, but it's really helpful to know that you're on that path as opposed to thinking everything's fine and just proceeding along just as you had been. On the flip side of that, you could find out that there's validation for what you're doing, and you might hear things like, can it do X functionality, or this is just like some other product that I'm familiar with, right? And what they're doing in that sense is they're actively thinking about what you're doing, which is kind of an accomplishment in and of itself, because if you're talking to someone, especially a stranger, about what you're creating, the odds are they just won't care, right? But if they're actually actively thinking and applying energy to your product and extrapolating what features it might have later on or at launch, then that means they're at least interested enough, the product or service is speaking to them enough to get them invested in it to some degree. So that would be really helpful because you might learn about features that would be really helpful to launch with that you weren't otherwise considering. So either way, whether you're on one of these tracks, it's helpful to know and adjust so that you can make the most of your launch. So this is kind of a higher level sort of, is it the right thing or wrong thing to do? You can also get a lower level of information from these encounters that is more practical as well, which relates to the sort of usability of what you're producing. So this is something that's really well known within user experience circles. But if you just put your product or your service in front of 5 different people, just 5, you'll capture about 85% of the usability issues with your product or service, which is insane because any company can get 5 people to use a prototype of some kind. And the fact that 5 of them will give you 85% of your overall issues is really powerful to know. I put a quote over here. This is the Nielsen-Norman group, by the way, that conducted the study. But I put a quote from the study that is over on the right here, which is, the difference between 0 and even a little bit of data is astounding, which if you just look at this graph, obviously 0 people is giving you 0 information, right? But 1 person, they can actually get you up to about, what is that, a little above 25% maybe of your usability issues. So this is really practical to know. And these are simple things that you can take action on immediately, like changing colors or moving buttons around or making something more clear, which again is going to put you in the best possible situation once it comes time to launch, because people are going to find these things no matter what. So it's better to find them sooner and correct them so that everybody else that comes after has a better experience dealing with whatever it is you're doing. So now that we've discussed some of the benefits that you can expect from talking to customers before launching, what would I have done to avoid this situation myself and not make this mistake? There are a few different things I would have done, all of which center around the idea of spending the least amount of money possible and the quickest turnaround times possible. And the way you do that is by not building something, or at least building the least amount possible. And so the first thing I would have done is a Wizard of Oz prototype, which is, if you're unfamiliar, a prototype where you mock the experience up that you want customers to have in an ideal scenario, and then you manually handle everything behind the scenes that the customer isn't aware of. So if you're doing something like an e-commerce store or something like that, and a customer orders, you can mock up the experience of building the checkout process, for instance. And when the customer submits the order, you go about manually handling everything behind the scenes, even though from their perspective it might seem completely automated. So it's really just about doing things that are not scalable ultimately, but if you can get this in front of 5 people, as we mentioned, you identified most of your problems that way. So that's the first thing I would have done. The second thing is a demo video, which is also very simple to do if you have some video editing chops. The most successful example of this would be Dropbox's video. They were building their alpha product, I believe it was, and at the time they didn't have a fully functioning, perfect experience. So what they did was they put a video together to show people what they wanted it to look like in the ideal scenario. And so they just edited the video in such a way that it seemed like everything was working perfectly, and they shared it on something like YouTube and got, I believe, millions of people on their waiting list based on that video alone, which is pretty amazing. And it doesn't take much to do, because again, you don't need a fully functioning product to put a video together and edit things as if they are working properly. The last thing I would have done, or at least one of the other things I would have done, is just get anything in front of the customer. So getting feedback on a design such as the one we're looking at right now is quite simple, because this design doesn't take much to put together, but at the same time we can already start to understand what the purpose or functionality of this page might be. So obviously this is for a social media of some kind, right? You see the like button, you get some photos. Even though they're just gray boxes, you can start to understand what's going on here, and you can collect feedback on this. So maybe you want to move the like button to a more prominent position, or maybe the boxes at the bottom of the page are kind of confusing and should be put in a single column or something like that. So it doesn't really take much. This could be a sketch on a napkin for all I care, but it's enough to start getting some feedback from people. Doesn't require a lot of investment, and you'll be doing yourself a favor in the long run. The next mistake we have to talk about today is something also commonly perpetrated by newer entrepreneurs, which is almost a cliche at this point. It's common, it's so common, but I did this myself, so we're going to talk about it, and that is not marketing early enough. So this is similar in nature to the first mistake, in the sense that they both come from the same underlying issue, at least for me they did, which is an aversion to external information that may invalidate some of our beliefs or assumptions about the way the world works and how valuable what we're building is in that world. But it really puts us at a disadvantage if we work for months on something, day in and day out, only to launch to crickets. Because we might have spent a lot of time and energy building our product, and if people don't know about it, they're not going to become customers. And especially when you pair this with, if you built the wrong product with the first mistake, and then you have to scramble to get your channels together after launch, then you're doing 2 jobs that are critical to the success of your business simultaneously. So this would be really a disadvantage for you to start. And the reason I did this is because I think I was, again, operating under the flawed assumption that if you built something like valuable enough for your potential customer, that they would just beat a path to your door and demand the products, right? The idea that if you build it, they will come, which, if you're familiar, or unfamiliar, this is the field from Field of Dreams, which is where that phrase comes from. If you build it, they will come. But that's not how the world works. And plus, it also pisses off Kevin Costner because it's likely copyright infringement to operate your life this way. So it's best to avoid these legal issues and avoid the mistake altogether. But part of the reason this is such a challenge is because figuring out which channels, marketing, sales, advertising, are going to be the perfect mix for you to grow profitably is somewhat of a balancing act, because what you're going to find is that most people just aren't going to care about what you're doing. And you might have some incorrect assumptions about who does care about what you're doing and how to reach them profitably. And this is because I think partly that people are advertised at from every angle, online and offline. And even if you choose the right customer and the right problem, you need to find them at the right place in the right time. So if you advertise or pitch your product to someone that may have a need for it at the wrong time, maybe it's not the right contextual situation, maybe they're not experiencing the pain of the problem that you solve or some other factor involved, they might not care at that particular time about what you're doing, even though it may be a solution that they could have a use for. So that's where the balancing act kind of comes in. So it's going to take some experimentation to figure out how you're going to be able to reach customers when they care at a profitable, repeatable rate. So what would I have done to avoid this problem in the first place, this mistake in the first place? And I think the most crucial aspect of any product or service you're developing is that you choose a specific customer. Because once you've chosen a customer, you are able to get much more specific about the questions you ask regarding things like where they hang out online. And this might be things like Reddit or Facebook, but once you understand where they hang out online, you can then start interacting with them and providing value so that you start building credibility for yourself. And then you can also start to figure out things like, where do these people go when they need the solution that you offer? Maybe they go to Google, or they search for answers on Quora, or YouTube for that matter. So they might have some predominant method for which they search for the solution that you provide, and it would be helpful to know those things so that you can plan the rest of your business around them sooner rather than later. The last mistake we're going to discuss today is a little bit more meta in nature, so it's less specific, it's more philosophical, but it's also the underlying reason I think the other two mistakes took place, and that is avoiding the hard thing. So we, as human beings, we have this tendency to seek pleasure and avoid pain, and in business what I think that means is we focus on the things that we're good at, and we avoid the things that we're not so good at. So if we're good at designing or development, we might want to focus on those things and avoid marketing or sales or customer service or finance or any number of the other activities it takes to create a successful business. But those things that we're avoiding are probably some of the most important that we need to address. So as a general framework for prioritizing problems, some of the first things that you might want to look at are what you're avoiding. So for me, what that was originally was the blog. So I kept thinking there had to be a cheaper, faster way to generate business than investing in doing content and waiting for that content to rank. Plus, I wanted to stay behind the scenes. I didn't want to necessarily put myself out in the public eye. And so I tried everything else besides blogging before I tried blogging. But once I did, it ultimately became the number one way that we were generating business. So it saved our business. We wouldn't even be here talking about this today had I not done that. So that was a good outcome from addressing something that I was avoiding. Unfortunately, it just took me a lot longer than it should have to do it. The next thing I was avoiding was the YouTube channel. And so likewise, this is also a marketing activity, but I wasn't really particularly thrilled with the idea of putting myself on screen and trying to be like an influencer of some kind. And so I just didn't do it. But through the process with the blog and the results we saw from that, I figured, you know what, it's worth a shot, and ultimately decided to do it. And we have a couple videos now that are actually generating a good amount of views on a monthly basis, about 2,000 views per month that are relevant leads for the business. And so it's adding on further to the success. And so I'm going to keep doing this and see what happens, but another good outcome as a result of addressing something I was avoiding. Lastly, probably one of the biggest things I was avoiding was learning to code. So this isn't going to be particularly relevant for everybody. Maybe you're a business that develops a physical product or something else entirely, a service. But for me, we have a software product. And so software and coding is a large part of the business. And if you don't understand a large part of your business, then you're at a severe disadvantage because you're going to make terrible decisions. You're going to end up doing things like delaying new features and making things more complicated than they need to be. So when I learned to code, I immediately, this wasn't immediate because nobody immediately learns to code, but I was able to get better at communicating with my developers. So when we talked about new features and new ways to implement new functionality, I was able to discuss that in a much more intelligent manner. They were able to understand much more clearly. So, and not only that, I was able to design those features in a way that made it easier to develop in the first place so that they required less resources. So all around, this, I think, was something that if I had done sooner, I would have gone about executing the business in an entirely different way. But again, I was nervous or afraid to learn to code because, who wouldn't be? It's just a lot of knowledge to know. But once I did that, there was extreme benefits that we're able to capitalize on now, and I'm able to think about the product in an entirely different way. Because whenever we learn new skills like this, we actually rewire our brain to open up new neural pathways, essentially. And I actually think about problems, I think, differently as a result of learning to code as well. So, there's just numerous benefits. Probably one of the things I'm happiest with learning. And again, all three of these were things that I was avoiding that ended up being some of the greatest things that I've done so far. And I hope that this was at least enough evidence for you to maybe start addressing some of the things that you're avoiding. So hopefully those were some helpful real-life examples for why you shouldn't be avoiding the things that are hard. And now that we know that there are some benefits to addressing these issues, how do we go about replicating this for your situation? Well, the first thing that I would do is take note of the things that I'm avoiding. And they're happening when they happen. You might not be able to go down a running list of all the things you're avoiding right now, but when you're in the situation that you get this almost physical reaction because you're avoiding something you shouldn't, that would be a good time to write it down as one of the things that you might need to address. And if it's a particularly large thing that you need to address, we need to start small. So the best way to accomplish any large goal is to break it down into its component parts and just take steps towards it each day. And do that without fail. Because small progress made daily is one of the best ways to start achieving exponential growth in yourself, in your skill set. So no matter how large this goal might be, you can always break it down further, take steps towards it, and before you know it, you'll achieve what it is you set out to achieve. It's like that old saying, the best way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time, and achieving goals is no different. And it's changed the way that I execute our business because we have a lot of big goals and sometimes it's hard to know where to start. But you might be wrong about some of what these steps are, but you can always adjust as you go along because you're not going to make any progress unless you take steps. And you're going to stumble along the way. It might not be a straight path, but you will get there. So that's it for me today, but if you have any questions or suggestions for future videos, please drop a comment below. If you did like this video, please give it a like and a subscribe to help us out, and we will see you next time.